The ships are leaving Cork harbor, their holds full to bursting. Grain and oats, butter and eggs, beef and pork food grown on Irish soil, by Irish hands, under Irish reign. The ships sail east, toward England, toward markets where this food will fetch good prices, toward tables where well-fed people will eat well. The harbor is busy with commerce, with prosperity, with the machinery of empire functioning exactly as designed. And on the docks, watching the ships depart, stand the people who grew that food. They are thin, growing thinner. Their children cry from hunger. Their potatoes, the only food they were allowed to keep for themselves, have rotted in the ground, turned to black slime by a disease no one understands. They watch their food sail away, and they begin to die. Welcome to the Great Irish Famine. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss another journey into historical darkness. And if you're already subscribed, you know the drill. Leave a like on this video. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps more than you know. And honestly, the algorithm treats me about as well as the British government treated the Irish. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, the ships are sailing, and 1 million people are about to die. The Great Famine and Gordamo are in Irish. The Great Hunger struck Ireland between 1845 and 1852. In those 7 years, approximately 1 million people died of starvation and disease. Another 1 million fled the country, cramming onto ships bound for America, Canada, Australia, anywhere that wasn't Ireland. An island of 8 million people lost a quarter of its population in less than a decade. But this was not simply a natural disaster, a blight that struck and could not be prevented. The potato crop failed. Yes, but Ireland grew plenty of other food. Throughout the famine years, ships continued to export Irish grain, Irish cattle, Irish provisions to England. There was enough food in Ireland to feed the Irish. That food was simply not for them. The famine was a catastrophe shaped by politics, by economics, by ideology, by centuries of colonial exploitation. The British government, which ruled Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, made choices about relief, about trade, about who deserved to live and who could be allowed to die. Those choices turned a crop failure into a Holocaust. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore what happened during those terrible years. The lives of ordinary Irish people before the blight. The failure of the potato and the beginning of starvation. The British response, or lack of response. The coffin ships that carried the desperate across the Atlantic. The legacy that still shapes Ireland and its diaspora today. This is the brutal reality of the Irish famine. Get comfortable. The ships are sailing to understand the famine. You first need to understand the Ireland that existed before it, a country shaped by centuries of English conquest, colonization, and exploitation. Ireland in the 1840s was not an independent nation. It had been formally united with Great Britain in 1801, becoming part of the United Kingdom, ruled from London by a parliament in which Irish Catholics had minimal representation. But the reality of English control went back much further, to the Tudor conquests, to Cromwell's brutal campaign, to the penal laws that had stripped Catholics of rights, property, and power. The land of Ireland was largely owned by English and Anglo-Irish Protestants, many of whom lived in England and never saw their Irish estates. These absentee landlords extracted rent from tenant farmers who worked the land but owned nothing. The tenants had no security. They could be evicted at will, with no compensation for any improvements they had made. The tenant farmers subdivided their holdings among their children, generation after generation, until the plots became impossibly small. A family might survive on a few acres, sometimes less than an acre. On such tiny holdings, only one crop could provide enough calories to sustain life: the potato. The Irish peasantry was desperately poor by any standard. They lived in one-room cottages with dirt floors, often sharing space with their animals. They owned almost nothing. They had no savings, no reserves, no margin for error. Their entire existence depended on the potato harvest. If that failed, they had nothing to fall back on. This was the Ireland that awaited the blight, a country of extreme inequality, colonial exploitation, and dangerous dependency on a single crop. The disaster that followed was not random misfortune. It was the predictable result of a system designed to extract wealth from Ireland while leaving its people with barely enough to survive. The potato was not native to Ireland. It came from South America, brought to Europe by Spanish explorers, and gradually spread across the continent. By the 19th century, it had become the foundation of Irish peasant life, the difference between survival and starvation. The potato had remarkable advantages for the Irish poor. It grew well in Ireland's wet climate and acidic soil. It produced more calories per acre than any grain crop. A small plot of potatoes, properly tended, could feed a family for a year. A single acre might yield 6 tons of potatoes, enough to sustain a family and their pig. The potato was also nutritious. Combined with milk, and Irish peasants often kept a cow or had access to buttermilk potatoes, provided a reasonably complete diet. The Irish poor were actually healthier than many European peasants, despite their poverty. They were taller, stronger, with fewer nutritional deficiencies. The potato, however monotonous, kept them alive and relatively well, but dependence on a single crop was catastrophically dangerous. The Irish poor ate potatoes for breakfast, dinner, and supper. A working man might consume 10 to 14 pounds of potatoes daily. There was no variety, no alternative, no backup plan. If the potato crop failed, there was simply nothing else, and the potato was vulnerable. Different varieties had different susceptibilities to disease, weather, and pests. The variety most common in Ireland, the lumper, was high-yielding, but particularly susceptible to disease. The Irish were betting their survival on a single variety of a single crop, and they had no idea how high the stakes were. The system that created this dependency was not natural or inevitable. It was the product of colonial land policies that left peasants with plots too small for diverse agriculture. Combined with an economy that exported Ireland's grain and livestock while leaving its people with only potatoes. The potato was Ireland's lifeline, but the conditions that made it so were created by human choices. If you're enjoying this journey into Irish history, take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and I promise the blight is only the beginning dot in the summer of 1845. A disease appeared in potato fields across Europe. It had crossed the Atlantic from America, traveling in infected seed potatoes, spreading wherever conditions were right. It reached Ireland in September, and within weeks, it had transformed the landscape. The disease was caused by Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that attacked potato plants with devastating efficiency. The first sign was dark spots on the leaves, spreading rapidly, turning whole fields from green to black almost overnight. Then came the smell of sickening sweetness as the plants rotted where they stood. The potatoes themselves seemed fine at first. Farmers dug them up, relieved to find what looked like a normal harvest. But within days, the tubers began to rot too, turning into black, slimy masses that stank of decay. Potatoes stored for the winter liquefied in the pits. The harvest that was supposed to sustain families until the next year simply dissolved. The blight was not evenly distributed in 1,845. Some areas were devastated. Others escaped relatively unscathed. Overall, perhaps a third of the potato crop was lost. This was serious, but not necessarily catastrophic. Previous partial failures had caused hardship, but not mass death. People hoped that 1846 would be better, Dot. It wasn't. The blight returned in 1846, and this time it was total. Nearly the entire potato crop was destroyed across Ireland. Fields that had been green with healthy plants in July were rotting wastelands by August. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. There would be no potatoes to eat, no seed potatoes to plant, nothing between the Irish poor and starvation. The Great Famine had truly begun. The winter of 1845 to 46 brought the first taste of what was to come. The partial crop failure of 1845 left many families short of food, and as their meager stores ran out, hunger began to spread. The poor sold what little they had to buy food: their pigs, their chickens, their furniture, their clothes. They ate foods they would normally never touch: cabbage stalks, turnip tops, anything that could fill a stomach. They begged from those slightly better off. They applied for relief at the workhouses, those grim institutions designed to make poverty as unpleasant as possible. Deaths began, though not yet in catastrophic numbers. The old and the weak succumbed first, their bodies unable to endure the deprivation. Children fell ill with diseases that well-fed bodies might have fought off. Families watched their members weaken, watched the flesh melt from their bones, watched death approach. But there was hope. The failure of 1845 might be a one-time event. If the crop succeeded in 1846, the crisis would pass. People tightened their belts, endured the hunger, planted their seed potatoes with prayers, and crossed fingers. The government, under Prime Minister Robert Peel, took modest steps importing corn from America, establishing public works programs that suggested help was coming. The spring of 1846 brought relief. The potato plants grew strong and green, covering the fields with the promise of abundance. By July, it seemed the nightmare was ending. The plants were healthy, the tubers were forming, the harvest would be good. Then, in a matter of days, everything changed. The blight returned with a vengeance. The healthy fields blackened and rotted. The hope that had sustained people through the first winter collapsed into despair. The first year had been a warning. The second year was the catastrophe. The British government's response to the Irish. Famine has been debated for nearly 2 centuries. Was it inadequate? Deliberately cruel? Genocidal? The answers depend partly on facts and partly on how one weighs the choices that were made. The initial response under Prime Minister Robert Peel was relatively active. Peel imported Indian corn, maize, from America to sell cheaply, helping stabilize food prices. He established public works programs that employed the poor, giving them wages to buy food. These measures were limited, but they showed that the government recognized a crisis and was willing to act. Then Peel's government fell in June 1846, replaced by a Whig administration under Lord John Russell. The new government brought a different philosophy, one that would prove catastrophic for Ireland. The Whigs believed in laissez-faire economics, the idea that markets should operate without government interference. They believed that providing too much relief would make the Irish dependent, would interfere with the natural operation of the economy, would cost too much money. They believed, fundamentally, that the market would solve the problem if left alone. Charles Trevelyan, the Treasury official most responsible for famine relief, embodied this philosophy. He saw the famine as an opportunity, a chance to reform Irish agriculture, to clear the land of inefficient small farmers, to modernize the economy through what he called the operation of natural causes. He believed the Irish were lazy and needed to learn self-reliance. He saw suffering as redemptive. The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson, Trevelyan wrote, and that calamity must not be too much mitigated. This was not a fringe view. It represented mainstream British thinking about Ireland and about poverty. The Irish were dying, and many in Britain believed they deserved to. If you're settling in for the night, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment, because we're about to discuss the people who owned Ireland but did not live there. The landlords of Ireland were, for the most part, Protestants of English or Scottish descent. Many had acquired their lands through conquest and confiscation, taking property from Irish Catholics during the various plantations and upheavals of the 16th and 17th centuries. They were the colonial elite, the beneficiaries of Ireland's subordination. Many landlords were absentees, living in England while agents managed their Irish estates. They had never seen the tenant farmers who paid them rent, never walked the fields that generated their income. Ireland was a source of revenue, not a home. When the famine struck, these absentee landlords were insulated from its reality. The landlord's primary interest was rent collection. The tenant farmers, even in good years, struggled to pay. In famine years, payment became impossible. Some landlords showed forbearance, reducing rents or forgiving arrears. Others, perhaps most, demanded payment regardless, enforcing their claims through eviction when tenants could not pay. The landlords faced their own pressures. Many were in debt, their estates mortgaged, their income already committed. They had obligations to creditors that left little room for generosity. When tenants couldn't pay, landlords faced the choice of absorbing the loss or removing the tenants and trying to find someone who could pay. But the landlords also had power. They controlled the land, controlled access to relief in some areas, controlled the local political machinery. Some used the famine as an opportunity to clear their estates, replacing numerous small tenants with fewer large farmers, or converting cropland to more profitable grazing. The famine served their economic interests, and some landlords acted on that interest with cold efficiency. The evictions were among the most traumatic experiences of the famine, seared into Irish memory for generations. Families who could not pay rent were thrown out of their homes, their cottages demolished behind them, left to die by the roadside. The process was brutally efficient. The landlord's agent would arrive with a crew of men often protected by police or soldiers to execute the eviction. The family would be given minutes to gather whatever they could carry. Then they were pushed out, and the demolition began. The cottages were pulled down deliberately to prevent the evicted families from returning. Roofs were stripped, walls knocked in, chimneys toppled. What had been a home became a pile of rubble. The families stood in the road, often in rain or cold, watching their shelter destroyed, knowing they had nowhere to go. The numbers were staggering. During the famine years, hundreds of thousands of people were evicted. Estimates range from 250,000 to 500,000 individuals. Some landlords cleared entire townlands, removing every tenant, leaving the landscape empty of human habitation. The village of Ballinglass in County Galway saw 300 people evicted in a single day in March 1846. The evicted had few options. Some made their way to the workhouses, which were rapidly overflowing. Some built scalps, temporary shelters dug into hillsides or ditches, covered with whatever materials could be found. Some simply wandered, begging, dying on the roads. Winter evictions were particularly lethal. Families thrown out in December or January often did not survive to spring. The evictions continued throughout the famine, even as death tolls mounted, even as international observers expressed horror. The landlord's right to clear their property was protected by law, and the British government made no serious effort to stop the clearances. The evicted were expendable. The workhouse was the centerpiece of British poor relief, a system designed not to help the poor, but to make poverty so unpleasant that people would do anything to avoid it. During the famine, the workhouses became overcrowded warehouses of death. The workhouse system had been extended to Ireland in 1838, just 7 years before the famine began. The principle was less eligibility conditions in the workhouse should be worse than the conditions of the poorest independent laborer, so that no one would enter except in absolute desperation. The workhouses were deliberately harsh, designed to deter applicants. To enter the workhouse, a family had to surrender everything. They had to give up their home, their furniture, their possessions. They had to accept separation: men in one wing, women in another, children in a third. Husbands were separated from wives, parents from children. The family unit was deliberately broken as a condition of receiving help. Inside, conditions were grim. The diet was minimal stirabout, a thin porridge, and bread, occasionally with milk. Work was required: stone breaking for men, oakum picking for women, pointless labor designed to justify the relief provided. Discipline was strict, punishments harsh. The workhouse was a prison in everything, but named as the famine intensified, the workhouses filled beyond capacity. Buildings designed for hundreds held thousands. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery swept through the workhouse populations. People entered the workhouse to escape starvation and died of fever instead. Some workhouses ran out of money entirely, unable to feed even the people already inside. The poor law system required local ratepayers to fund relief, and in the poorest areas, precisely where relief was most needed, there were no ratepayers left to tax. The system collapsed under the weight of the disaster it was supposed to address. In 1847, the British government briefly changed course, establishing a network of soup kitchens that provided direct food relief to the starving. It was the most effective intervention of the famine, and it was abandoned after just 6 months. The Temporary Relief Act of 1847 authorized the distribution of free food to those who needed it. At its peak, the soup kitchen system fed 3 million people daily, nearly half the Irish population. The soup was thin, the bread minimal, but it was food, and it kept people alive who would otherwise have died. The soup kitchens worked. For a few months in 1847, the death rate declined. People who had been starving began to recover. The direct provision of food, however inadequate, was more effective than any other measure the government had tried. It demonstrated that mass starvation could be prevented if the will existed, but the government never intended the soup kitchens to be permanent. They were expensive, and they violated the principles of laissez-faire economics that guided British policy. In the autumn of 1847, the soup kitchens were closed, and relief was returned to the workhouse system. The dying resumed. The soup kitchens also gave rise to a shameful phenomenon: souperism. Some Protestant missionaries offered food to Catholics who would convert to Protestantism. The starving faced an impossible choice: abandon their faith or watch their children die. Some converted as supers or jumpers and were ostracized by their communities. Others refused and starved. The memory of souperism poisoned relations between Catholics and Protestants for generations. Whether the phenomenon was widespread or limited to certain areas is debated, but its symbolic power was enormous. It represented the exploitation of desperation, the use of hunger as a weapon of conversion, a betrayal that could never be forgiven. If you're still with me on this journey through Irish suffering, take a moment to hit subscribe. Your support helps me create more historical deep dives for your bedtime listening. And speaking of feudal labor, let's discuss the public works programs. Public works were the British government's preferred form of relief, putting the poor to work building roads, rather than simply giving them food. The theory was that work preserved dignity, taught discipline, and prevented dependency. The practice was mass death. The public works programs employed hundreds of thousands of Irish workers at their peak in early 1847. The workers built roads, mostly roads that went nowhere, that served no economic purpose, that were never used. The point was not to build useful infrastructure, but to provide employment that would justify paying wages. The wages were pitifully low, often 8 pence a day. The work was brutal, breaking stones, moving earth, laboring in all weather with inadequate clothing. Workers were already weakened by months of malnutrition. The heavy labor consumed what little energy they had left. Many collapsed on the job sites. The work was often conducted on a piece rate basis, meaning workers were paid for what they accomplished rather than for time worked. This discriminated against the weak, precisely those most in need of help. A healthy man might earn enough to buy food. A starving man, working slowly because he had no strength, earned nothing. The weather made everything worse. The winter of 1846 to 47 was one of the coldest in memory. Workers labored in snow and freezing rain, their thin clothing soaked through, their bodies burning the few calories they consumed just to maintain warmth. Many died on the roads, collapsed in ditches, frozen where they fell. By spring 1847, the government recognized that the public works were failing. They were costing enormous sums while failing to prevent mass death. The switch to soup kitchens followed briefly, but the ideology that had produced the public works would soon reassert itself with fatal consequences. Starvation killed many, but disease killed more. The famine created perfect conditions for epidemic illness, and the diseases that swept through Ireland in the late 1840s claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Typhus was the great killer. Transmitted by body lice, It spread rapidly among people crowded together in workhouses, fever hospitals, and emigrant ships. The disease began with fever, headache, and a characteristic rash, and often progressed to delirium and death. It was called famine fever because it accompanied starvation wherever starvation occurred. Relapsing fever was another louse-borne disease that ravaged the weakened population. Its pattern of fever, apparent recovery, and then relapse gave it its name. It was less deadly than typhus, but contributed to the overall mortality, weakening survivors and making them vulnerable to other illnesses. Dysentery spread through contaminated water and food. As sanitation collapsed, as people ate anything they could find, drank from polluted sources, lived in increasingly squalid conditions, dysentery became endemic. It killed through dehydration and exhaustion, draining the body of fluids it couldn't replace. Scurvy appeared as diets became increasingly deficient. Without vitamin C from fresh vegetables, and with potatoes no longer available, guns bled, wounds refused to heal, and immune systems collapsed. Scurvy alone was rarely fatal, but it made everything else worse. The fever hospitals that were supposed to treat the sick became death traps. Overcrowded, understaffed, lacking basic supplies, they concentrated the disease together and spread infection. Doctors and nurses died alongside their patients. Some hospitals reported mortality rates of 50% or higher. The diseases showed no mercy based on class. Landlords, clergymen, doctors, officials, anyone who worked with the sick or the poor was vulnerable. Many who tried to help died for their compassion. The famine killed its helpers as well as its victims. The dead were everywhere. In the cottages, on the roads, in the fields. In the ditches, bodies lay where they fell, sometimes for days before anyone could bury them. The living often lacked the strength to bury the dead. A family weakened by starvation might not have the energy to dig a grave. They would leave the body where it lay, or drag it outside the cottage, or simply remain with it, too weak to move. Relief workers entering cottages sometimes found the living and dead together. The survivors too far gone to care. Mass graves became necessary. In some areas, the dead were buried in pits without coffins, without ceremony, without markers. The rituals that surrounded death, the wake, the keening, the prayers, became impossible luxuries. The dead were disposed of as quickly as possible, before disease could spread, before the sight became unbearable. The bodies told the story of how their owners had died. Many had green-stained mouths. They had eaten grass, nettles, anything green they could find. Their digestive systems unable to process plant matter that healthy bodies would never consume. This green mouth became a signature of famine death, evidence of the desperate measures people took before the end. Some bodies were found with food in their hands, food they had obtained but were too weak to eat, their systems shutting down even as nourishment arrived. The irony was unbearable. People died with food literally in their grasp, their bodies no longer capable of using it. The death toll was concentrated in the poorest areas, the West Coast, the mountainous regions, the places where potato dependency was most complete. Entire villages were wiped out. Townlands that had held hundreds of people stood empty. The landscape itself seemed to be dying, emptying of the human presence that had shaped it for centuries. The children suffered most. Too young to find food on their own, entirely dependent on parents who often had nothing to give. They died in enormous numbers during the famine years. Infant mortality soared. Mothers weakened by starvation could not produce milk. Babies died of malnutrition before they were old enough to eat solid food. Even children who survived infancy faced desperate odds. Their small bodies had no reserves. Once starvation began, it progressed quickly. The symptoms were heartbreaking. The protruding bellies of kwashiorkor, caused by protein deficiency. The skeletal limbs. The old, wizened faces on young bodies. The apathy that replaced normal childish energy. Parents watched their children transform into something barely recognizable and could do nothing. Many children were orphaned. Both parents might die, leaving children alone with no one to care for them. These orphans wandered the roads, begged at workhouse gates, gathered in groups that survivors described as looking like living skeletons. Some were taken in by relatives or neighbors. Many were not. The workhouses filled with children. Orphans abandoned children, children whose parents could no longer feed them. They crowded into institutions that were overwhelmed and understaffed. Disease swept through the children's wards. Many who entered the workhouse never left it alive. Some children were sent abroad to America, to Australia, to wherever they might survive. These famine orphans were separated from everything they knew, shipped across oceans, deposited in strange lands. Some were adopted into families. Others were exploited as cheap labor. They carried the trauma of the famine into new countries, new lives, new generations. If you're settling in for sleep, subscribe and leave a comment about what dark historical topic you'd like me to cover next. Because now we need to discuss how the famine affected women in particular ways. Women were often the last to eat in Irish families. The men, who did the heavy labor, received priority. The children, who were most vulnerable, came next. Women gave up their portions so others could survive, sacrificing themselves for their families. This selflessness accelerated their decline. Pregnant women and nursing mothers faced particular dangers. Their bodies needed extra nutrition that wasn't available. Miscarriages increased. Stillbirths became common. Women who carried pregnancies to term often couldn't produce milk. The cycle of reproduction that had sustained Irish families broke down as the famine deepened. Some women turned to prostitution to survive. In towns and port cities, desperate women exchanged their bodies for food or money. This was survival sex in the most literal sense. The alternative was death. Some women made this choice for themselves. Others were pushed into it to support children or siblings. Women's traditional knowledge became useless. The skills of cooking, preserving, making food stretch. None of it mattered when there was no food to cook, preserve, or stretch. Women who had always managed to keep their families fed found themselves helpless. The powerlessness was devastating. Some women showed remarkable resilience. They held families together through impossible circumstances, found food when there seemed to be none, made decisions that kept children alive. The stories that survived often center on women's ingenuity and sacrifice. The mothers who gave everything and sometimes, against all odds, succeeded, but many didn't survive. Women died of starvation, of fever, of childbirth complications their weakened bodies couldn't handle. They died caring for sick family members. They died after everyone else in their families had died, alone in empty cottages, with no one left to mourn them. The darkest fact of the Irish famine is this: while 1 million people starved to death, Ireland continued to export food to England. Throughout the famine years, ships left Irish ports carrying grain, oats, barley, cattle, pigs, butter, and eggs. The quantities were enormous enough, by some calculations, to feed the starving population. The food was grown in Ireland, on Irish land, often by Irish laborers. It sailed away while the laborers died. How was this possible? The answer lies in the economics of colonialism. Irish farmers grew crops for export because that's what paid the rent. The grain and cattle weren't theirs to keep. They belonged to landlords who demanded payment. Selling the harvest was necessary to avoid eviction. The farmers kept only the potatoes, and the potatoes had failed. The British government could have stopped the exports. It could have imposed export bans, purchased food for distribution, intervened in the market to keep Irish food in Ireland. It chose not to. The principles of free trade were deemed more important than Irish lives. Interfering with commerce was unthinkable, even as people died for lack of food that was sailing past them. Food was actually imported during the famine, Indian corn. American grain, but not in sufficient quantities, and often at prices the starving couldn't afford. The imports never matched the exports. More food left Ireland than entered it, every year of the famine. The net flow was outward, away from the hungry, toward the well-fed dot. This is what distinguishes the Irish famine from a simple natural disaster. The blight destroyed the potato crop, but the famine was a human choice. The food existed. The decision was made to let people die rather than disrupt the market. That decision has a name. It's called policy dot at some point, often different for each family. The calculation changed. Staying in Ireland meant death. Leaving meant risk, the unknown terrors of the ocean crossing, an uncertain reception abroad, but at least a chance of survival. One by one, then in floods, the Irish chose to leave. The decision was agonizing. Ireland was home, the land where ancestors had lived for generations, where family was buried, where every hill and stream held memories. Leaving meant abandoning all of that, probably forever. The crossing was dangerous. Many didn't survive. And what waited on the other side? Stories filtered back of hostility, exploitation, disappointment. But staying meant watching your children starve. It meant waiting for the eviction notice that would throw you onto the road. It meant hoping for a crop that kept failing, for relief that never came, for mercy from a system that had none. At some point, the scales tipped, and leaving became the only choice. The emigrants were mostly poor. Those with something to lose stayed longer. They scraped together passage money by selling whatever they had left, or by accepting landlord-funded emigration schemes. Some landlords found it cheaper to ship tenants to America than to support them through the famine. They cleared their estates by funding departure. The departure was often chaotic and tragic. Families separated, never to reunite. Elderly parents were left behind because they wouldn't survive the crossing. Children were sent alone, entrusted to strangers, in the hope that someone in America would take them in. The docks became scenes of wailing, of desperate farewells, of partings that everyone knew were final dot. The emigrants took one last look at Ireland as their ships pulled away. Many would never see it again. They were leaving a dying country, carrying their grief and their rage across the ocean, to plant both in new soil. The vessels that carried Irish immigrants across the Atlantic became known as coffin ships, a grimly accurate name for vessels that killed a substantial portion of their passengers. Ships were often barely seaworthy. Old timber ships, poorly maintained, stuffed with as many passengers as could fit. They crossed the North Atlantic in a journey that took 4 to 12 weeks, depending on conditions. They were designed for cargo, not people. The holds where immigrants traveled had been built to carry timber or grain, not human beings. Conditions below deck were nightmarish. Passengers were crammed into spaces with minimal headroom, packed onto rough wooden bunks and tiers. There was little ventilation, no sanitation, inadequate food and water. The smells of sickness, of waste, of unwashed bodies in clothes. Confinement became overwhelming within days of departure. The passengers were already weakened when they boarded. Many had been starving for months or years. They brought diseases with them: typhus, dysentery, relapsing fever, and the crowded conditions ensured rapid spread. Once one person fell ill, the infection swept through the hold. The crews had little incentive to care for the passengers. Many ships were chartered by landlords or immigration agents who paid a flat fee and had no stake in whether passengers survived. The captains wanted to complete the voyage as quickly as possible. Stopping to tend the sick meant delays and expense. The dead were dumped overboard without ceremony. Some ships arrived with a third or more of their passengers dead. The survivors who staggered onto the docks in Quebec or Boston or New York were often barely alive themselves, carrying diseases that spread to those who received them. The coffin ships delivered a dying population to the New World. If you're still listening, subscribe and leave a comment, because now we're going to experience what it was like to cross the Atlantic on a coffin ship. The journey began in ports like Cork, Dublin, or Sligo, where immigrants gathered to await their ships. They might wait for days or weeks, sleeping rough, spending precious money on food, watching their hopes dim as they saw the vessels that would carry them. Boarding was chaotic. Passengers pushed and shoved to secure the best spaces away from the ladder where waste slopped down, near the occasional hatch that admitted air and light. Families tried to stay together, claiming bunks, marking territory in the dark hold. The ship sailed, and immediately the suffering began. Seasickness struck almost everyone, turning the hold into a pit of vomit. The rough seas of the North Atlantic threw passengers from their bunks, battered them against the ship's timbers. Storms could last for days, with the hatches battened down, the passengers in complete darkness, praying and screaming. Food was supposed to be provided, but it was often inadequate hard biscuit, perhaps some rice or oatmeal. Occasionally meat so salt-preserved, it had to be soaked for days. Fresh water was rationed and often foul. Cooking facilities were minimal and frequently unusable in rough weather. Passengers grew weaker by the day. The sick lay in their bunks, tended by family members who could do nothing for them. The dead were wrapped in canvas and slid over the side, sometimes with a brief prayer, sometimes with nothing. Children watched their parents die. Parents watched their children die. The sea claimed them all, leaving no graves to mark their passing. Week after week, the ship sailed on. Those who survived reached a point of numb endurance, no longer hoping, simply waiting for the journey to end one way or another. Gros Isle sits in the St. Lawrence River, about 50 kilometers downstream from Quebec City. In 1847, it became the quarantine station for immigrants arriving in Canada. It also became a mass grave. The Canadian authorities, overwhelmed by the flood of sick immigrants, established Gros Isle as a place to inspect arriving ships and isolate the diseased. The theory was sound: stop the sick before they spread disease to the mainland. The practice was catastrophic. The ships arrived faster and the station could process them. In 1847, over 100,000 Irish immigrants came to Canada, most of them through Gros Islet. The island's facilities, designed for a few hundred people, received tens of thousands. Ships waited at anchor for weeks, their passengers dying while they waited for inspection. The conditions on the island were barely better than on the ships. Fever sheds were thrown up to house the sick, but they overflowed immediately. Patients lay on the ground, on straw, in open air, in rain. There were never enough doctors, never enough nurses, never enough medicine, which wouldn't have helped anyway, since no effective treatment for typhus existed. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. Mass graves were dug, filled, dug again. Irish Catholics died on Protestant Canadian soil, far from home, without priests, without the rituals they had known. The island cemetery expanded daily. Over 5,000 Irish immigrants died on Gros Islet in 1847 alone. Thousands more died on the ships waiting at anchor, or in Quebec and Montreal after being released from quarantine. The island became sacred ground for the Irish diaspora, a place of memory, of mourning, of rage at what had been allowed to happen. The Irish immigrants who survived the crossing arrived in America with high hopes and empty pockets. They found a land of opportunity, but also a land of hostility toward the desperate strangers flooding its shores. The Irish arrived in huge numbers, concentrated in East Coast cities Boston, New York, Philadelphia. They overwhelmed the capacity of these cities to absorb them. They had no money, no skills suited to an urban economy, no connections. They crowded into the worst housing, took the lowest paying jobs, struggled to survive. American natives viewed the Irish with suspicion and contempt. They were Catholic in a Protestant country, poor in a society that equated poverty with moral failure, foreign in a nation still defining itself. The phrase, "no Irish need apply," appeared in job listings, expressing the discrimination that pervaded American life. The Irish became America's underclass, doing the dangerous, dirty work that others refused. They dug canals, built railroads, worked in mines and factories. They died in construction accidents, in industrial disasters, in epidemics that swept through their crowded tenements. They had escaped the famine only to face new forms of exploitation, but they also built communities. Irish neighborhoods formed in every major city ethnic enclaves, where the language, the customs, the religion of home could be maintained. Churches were the centers of these communities, providing not just spiritual sustenance, but practical support, jobs, education, political organization. Over time, the Irish rose. They entered politics, dominated police and fire departments, built businesses, educated their children. By the early 20th century, Irish Americans had become a powerful political and economic force. But they never forgot where they came from, never forgot why they had left, never forgot who had let their ancestors die. Not everyone left. Despite everything, some Irish people stayed in Ireland, endured the famine years, and survived. Their experience was different from the emigrants, but no less brutal. Those who stayed watched their communities dissolve. Neighbors died or emigrated. Villages that had been vibrant became silent. The familiar faces disappeared one by one, replaced by emptiness. The landscape itself changed as cottages crumbled, fields went untended, and the infrastructure of daily life fell apart. Survival required adaptability. People ate things they would never have considered before: seaweed, roots, the blood of their animals mixed with meal. They learned to identify edible plants, to catch fish, to hunt. Those with even small resources beyond the potato had advantages. Those entirely dependent on the potato had none. Some survived through the workhouse system, enduring its horrors to receive food. Some survived through charity, from relatives abroad, from religious organizations, from the occasional generous landlord. Some survived through crime, stealing food or livestock, risking imprisonment or transportation, got the social fabric frayed, but didn't entirely tear. Communities still held together in some areas, neighbors helping neighbors, families supporting families. The rituals of Irish life, the wakes, the festivals, the patterns of mutual aid continued in reduced form. Something of Irish culture survived even as Irish people died. When the famine finally eased in the early 1850s, the blight weakened. Alternative food sources developed, the survivors emerged into a transformed country. The population had dropped by half through death and emigration. The landscape was emptier. The society changed forever. Those who stayed had to rebuild, but they would never forget what they had endured. If you're settling in for sleep, subscribe and leave a comment. Because now we need to discuss what the famine did to Ireland's population. A wound that has never fully healed. Before the famine, Ireland's population was approximately 8 million. By 1851, it had fallen to about 6.5 million. By the end of the century, it was barely 4 million. No other country in Europe experienced such a catastrophic decline. No other country has failed to recover even now. The arithmetic of the collapse is brutal. Approximately 1 million people died during the famine years of starvation, of disease, of the complications of both. Another million emigrated during the same period. The emigration continued after the famine ended. By 1900, over 4 million Irish had left for America alone. The population decline was not evenly distributed. The poorest areas, the West, the mountains, the Irish-speaking regions were hit hardest. Some communities were simply erased, every inhabitant dead or gone. The Gaeltacht, the Irish-speaking heartland, was devastated. The language began its long decline toward near extinction. The social structure changed fundamentally. Before the famine, Ireland had been characterized by subdivision each generation, dividing the land among all children, creating smaller and smaller holdings. After the famine, inheritance patterns changed. Land went to one son. The others had to emigrate or remain unmarried. Family size declined. Marriage ages rose. The social patterns of rural Ireland were transformed. The demographic impact lasted for generations. Ireland's population continued to decline until the 1960s, reaching a low about 2.8 million in the Republic. Only in recent decades has the population begun to recover, and it remains below the pre-famine level. The famine created a wound in Irish demography that has taken almost 2 centuries to begin healing. Even at the time, the British response to the Irish famine was controversial. Some voices called for more aid, for export bans, for whatever measures were necessary to stop the dying. They were overruled, but their arguments entered the historical record dot in Parliament. Irish members pleaded for action. Daniel O'Connell, the great Irish political leader, spoke with increasing desperation about the crisis. Others documented the suffering, presented statistics, appealed to conscience. They were largely ignored by a government committed to laissez-faire principles. Some British observers were horrified by what they saw. Journalists who visited Ireland sent back reports of mass death, of bodies in the roads, of suffering beyond description. The Illustrated London News published drawings of the famine that shocked comfortable English readers. The information was available. It was simply not acted upon. The arguments against intervention were economic and ideological. The market should not be disturbed. The Irish should learn self-reliance. Relief would create dependency. The cost was too great. Besides, hadn't the Irish brought this upon themselves through improvidence, through overpopulation, through Catholic backwardness? The proponents of relief never won the argument. The government provided some aid to public works, the soup kitchens, the workhouse system, but never at the scale necessary to prevent mass death. The famine was allowed to run its course, killing those it killed, expelling those it expelled, solving what many in Britain saw as the Irish problem. The debate continues to this day. Was the British response mere incompetence, or something worse? Were the deaths the result of tragic miscalculation or deliberate policy? The evidence supports various interpretations, and historians continue to argue. But the dead cannot argue. They can only accuse through their silence. The question hangs over the Irish famine. Was it genocide? Did the British government deliberately allow or cause the deaths of 1 million Irish people? The answer depends on definitions, evidence, and interpretation. The legal definition of genocide, established after the Holocaust, requires intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. By this standard, proving genocide requires proving that the British intended to destroy the Irish as a people, not merely that their policies resulted in mass death. The evidence for genocidal intent is circumstantial but substantial. British officials spoke of the famine as an opportunity to clear Ireland of its surplus population. They blocked relief measures that might have prevented death. They continued food exports while people starved. They expressed satisfaction at the decline in Irish population. Their policies seem designed to maximize harm, but the evidence also supports alternative interpretations. The British government did provide some relief, suggesting it didn't want everyone to die. The ideology of laissez-faire economics, rather than anti-Irish hatred, may explain the inadequate response. Incompetence, penny-pinching, and ideological blindness may be sufficient explanations without invoking genocide. The Irish nationalist tradition has long considered the famine an act of genocide, deliberate murder by the colonial power. This view shapes Irish identity and Irish-British relations to this day. For many Irish people, the question is not academic. It is a matter of acknowledging historic crime. Whether or not the legal term, genocide, applies, the moral reality is clear. The British government could have prevented mass death and chose not to. Its choices reflected contempt for Irish lives, commitment to ideology over humanity, and the cold calculus of colonial power. 1 million people died who didn't have to die. That is a crime, whatever we call it. The Irish famine ended, but its effects continue. The diaspora it created, the memories it implanted, the anger it generated, all of these remain alive. Nearly 2 centuries later, the Irish diaspora is one of the largest in the world. An estimated 70 million people worldwide claim Irish ancestry, more than 10 times the population of Ireland itself. This diaspora was created largely by the famine and its aftermath, by the millions who left and the descendants who never returned. The memory of the famine shapes Irish identity. It is taught in schools, commemorated in museums, memorialized in monuments from Dublin to New York to Sydney. The Great Hunger is not forgotten. It cannot be forgotten. It is the defining trauma of Irish history, the event that explains why Ireland is what it is, and isn't what it might have been got. The anger at Britain persists. The famine fueled Irish nationalism, convinced generations of Irish people that British rule meant death, that independence was necessary for survival. The fight for Irish independence, the risings, the war, the eventual partition, drew energy from famine memories. Even today, with Ireland independent and prosperous, the famine remains a source of grievance. Ireland has changed enormously since the famine. The country that was one of Europe's poorest is now one of its richest. The population has stabilized and begun to grow. Ireland has become a destination for immigrants rather than a source of immigrants. The transformation is remarkable, but it was built on the foundation of the famine dead. The lessons of the famine are still relevant. When markets are allowed to override human needs, when ideology trumps compassion, when the powerful decide that some lives don't matter. The famine teaches what happens when a government fails its most basic duty to keep its people alive. And so our journey through the Irish famine comes to an end. The ships have stopped sailing, or rather, they sail now with different cargo, different purposes, a different Ireland at either end. The cottages that once housed millions are ruins now, their stone walls crumbling into the hillsides, their roofs long fallen in. The roads that the famine victims built go nowhere, as they always did, monuments to pointless suffering, but the dead remain. They lie in mass graves throughout Ireland, in the fields where they fell, in the ditches where they collapsed. They lie at the bottom of the Atlantic, dumped from coffin ships, their names unknown, their numbers uncounted. They lie on Gross Isle and Staten Island, and every port where the famine refugees arrived. They are everywhere, and they are asking why. Why did they have to die? The blight destroyed the potatoes. Yes, but Ireland grew other food. Ships carried that food away while people starved. The government could have stopped the exports, could have fed the hungry, could have saved the dying. It chose not to. It chose ideology over humanity, economics over lives, the sanctity of property over the survival of a people. 1 million people died. 1 million more were expelled from their homeland. An ancient culture was shattered, a language nearly lost, a society transformed beyond recognition. And for what? So that landlords could collect their rents, so that merchants could make their profits, so that the principles of free trade could remain inviolate, so that the Irish could learn their lesson. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep in your comfortable bed, consider what it was like. The hunger that gnawed constantly, the fever that burned through your body, the choice between watching your children starve and putting them on a coffin ship, the departure from everything you knew, the crossing that killed so many, the arrival in a land where you were hated for being what you were. Consider the survivors, those who made it, who built new lives, who carried the memory across oceans and generations. Consider their descendants, who are everywhere now, who still remember, who still mourn, who still ask the questions that have no good answers. The famine is over. Ireland survived, transformed, diminished, but not destroyed. The Irish went everywhere, planted their culture in new soil. became part of nations that had not existed when the famine began. They carried their grief and their rage, their music and their stories, their faith and their stubbornness. They built the world we live in now, but they never forgot. They never forgave. And neither should we. The ships are still. The fields are green again. The hunger is over. But remember the million who died. Remember the million who left. Remember that it didn't have to happen, that it was a choice, that people decided to let other people die, not remember. It's the least we owe them. Sleep now, but remember.